So it's important when you're trying to analyze a problem of a loss in an organization to look at the performance of the individual stands to see whether there's a difference between the performance of Dan's stand versus Jen's stand, Downtown Crossing or Boston Common. And I'm presenting this information in the format of a contribution margin analysis. So let me go through that first for the combined organization, both stands, and then I'll show you the performance of Jen's stand in Boston Common compared to Dan in Downtown Crossing. So the way you present this is first the cups sold we know is 4,000 and times the price of $1.50 gives us revenue of 6,000. We subtract the direct variable expense, variable direct expense. Now the variable direct expense was those cups, the ice, and the lemons, which are used to produce the cup of lemonade. And if you remember that the variable direct expense was 50 cents per cup, the total variable direct expense then is 50 cents per cup times the 4,000 cups gives us the 2,000. When we subtract the 2,000 from 6,000 in revenue, we get what's called a variable contribution margin. The variable contribution margin is what's left from the revenue after subtracting the variable direct expenses. And it should be positive. If it's positive, we're really happy. Woohoo! Positive contribution margin. The idea there is something's left from the revenue to contribute to paying our fixed direct expense, which is there whether we produce lemonade or not, and our indirect expenses. So it's good to have a positive contribution margin. And the variable contribution margin is the first one we calculate, the most important. If you just see in the literature contribution margin, it's referring to this one, the variable contribution margin. Because if that is negative, then every cup of lemonade you produce, you're not making even the variable expenses back from the price that you're charging, and you probably shouldn't be in that line of business, or you should generate some other source of revenue to cross-subsidize yourself. So once we have this variable contribution margin, then we subtract our fixed direct expense. Remember, that's the rental of the stands and the attendants' salaries. And when we subtract the fixed direct expense, then we get a second contribution margin, which we call the direct contribution margin. The direct contribution margin is what's left from the revenue after we've subtracted all of our direct expenses, both fixed and variable. And it's what's left to contribute to our indirect expenses. It's a little harder to calculate, so it's not so easy to determine what are the direct costs of a unit, but this is very important because as long as that's positive, then that organization is contributing to its indirect costs, which are there anyway. So it's good to have a positive direct contribution margin. And in Lenny's Lemonade, it's a positive number. Then when we subtract our indirect expenses, which is Lenny's salary, we get our loss because the indirect expense is 2,000 and we only had a contribution of 1,000. So we still have our loss. So let's look now at the two stands. We have Jen and Dan. First of all, we have to look at the revenue, the number of cups sold. And I've divided it and said that Jen, whose stand is doing a little bit better in terms of cups sold 60%, whereas Dan sold 40%. You would get that kind of information from records that you kept. I just have estimated it, but this would be something that you would keep a record of through your cash register. They both are selling the cup of lemonade at $1.50. So we can calculate the total revenue. So price times quantity gives you total revenue of $3,600 for Jen's stand and 2,400 for Dan's. Now, the next thing we want to do is subtract our variable direct expense. So for Jen's stand, 50 cents per cup times 2,400 cups gives us a variable direct expense of 1,200. And for Dan, 50 cents a cup times 1,600 cups, Dan's variable direct expense is less, it's 800. When we subtract the variable direct expense from the revenue, we get the variable contribution margin. And that's what's left from the revenue after you've subtracted the variable direct expense to contribute to the fixed direct and the indirect. And in both cases, it's a positive number. For Jen, it's $2,400. For Dan, it's $1,600. And we're really happy to see those positive numbers. Woohoo! Positive numbers. Then we have our fixed direct expense. And for Jen's stand, it's her salary plus the rental of the stand. For Dan, same thing. So it's the same. When we subtract the fixed direct expense from the variable contribution margin, we get what we call the direct contribution margin. That's what's left after we've subtracted all of our direct expenses from our revenue, both our variable and our fixed direct expenses. And this money is left and it's able to contribute to our indirect expenses, or Lenny's salary. In both cases, it's a positive number. So again, we're very happy here to have positive direct contribution margins in both stands. Now we have to figure out, because we have two stands, we have to figure out a fair share of the indirect costs to attribute to each of the stands. And for Jen's stand, I've done this, for both stands, I've done this based on percent of time that Lenny spent supervising or traveling to those stands. In Jen's case, since the stand is going pretty well, it's 40% of the time, and for Dan's stand, it's 60% of the time. So I took the $2,000 total, and I multiplied it times 40%, and I gave Jen $800 worth of indirect costs, and I gave Dan $1,200. When you subtract the indirect costs from the direct contribution margin, you get your bottom line profit or loss, which is why it's called the bottom line. It's at the bottom of this contribution margin analysis. The bottom line for Jen is $100 of profit once you subtract those indirect costs. So she's covering all of her fixed direct and indirect costs as well as the variable costs, and she's making a profit for Lenny's Lemonade. Whereas Dan has a loss of $1,100. So this is mainly where our problem is. I want to do one quick sub-analysis. You could say, well, that's not fair, and often people do argue about the allocation of indirect costs. That's not fair, it shouldn't be based on time, it should be split evenly, Dan says. So we go back and we do what's called a sensitivity analysis. Let's just split it evenly. We'll say you each get 1,000 in indirect costs. And now we're going to recalculate our profit margin. If we subtract 1,000 from 900, we have a loss of 100. And we subtract 1,000 from 100, we have a loss of 900. So in this scenario, neither stand is generating a profit, but still Dan's stand is doing worse than Jen's stand, and we need to focus our attention maybe on what's going on here, which we'll do now as we look at some scenarios for changing the situation. And I think the first one that I want to look at is to say, what happens if we close Dan's stand? Dan's not doing well, get rid of him. Shut down that stand. So let's do it. What happens to our number of cups sold? Well, now we just have Jen's stand, right? So I'm going to call this revised. and we just have Jen's stand, so we have 2,400. Still $1.50 a cup. We're price takers in the market. We can't set the price, so we just have to accept that. We have 3,600 in revenue. Our variable direct expense is 50 cents per cup times 2,400 cups, or 1,200. So our variable contribution margin is the same as it was for Jen's stand, 2,400. That's what's left from our revenue after we've paid our variable direct expense. And this number can contribute to our fixed direct and our indirect. It's positive, so we're happy. We got rid of Dan's salary, and we got rid of the stand. So we don't have that extra $1,500 now in expenses. We have less. We only have the $1,500 from Jen's stand. So when we subtract the $1,500 in fixed direct expense from our variable contribution margin, we have a positive direct contribution margin of $900. So again, we're happy. We've covered all of our variable and fixed direct expenses. This is contribution to the indirect expense of Lenny. So we have $2,000 in Lenny's salary, and when we subtract the $2,000 from the $900, we get a $1,100 loss. So look, we're worse off than we were before. And you say, wait a minute, that stand had a loss, we got rid of it, and now we're worse off than we were before? How is that possible? Well, the reason it's possible is that Dan's stand was contributing to the indirect costs. It's this number right here. Dan had a positive contribution margin, and we lost that positive contribution margin when we closed Dan's stand. So we lost that $100 that was contributing and avoiding our loss. It was paying our indirect expenses. So in fact, we're worse off. This is a really important point because a lot of times people look at an organization, they look at a particular program that's losing money, and they say, hey, it's losing money, let's get rid of it. But they're only looking at the bottom line. They're not looking at these intermediate measures of profitability. A contribution margin is a measure of profitability. It's saying, yeah, I'm covering some costs and contributing to the indirect costs of this organization. So in fact, you shouldn't shut down this stand. You should actually increase the volume for this stand and let me make more money for you. So that's one scenario. Let's do a second scenario to see what might happen. And in this one, an organization, a charity, has approached Lenny and said to Lenny, gee, we want to hold a baseball tournament on Boston Common. We're excited about this. We're going to buy our lemonade from you. We want to ask you for 1,000 cups of lemonade. Lenny gets all excited. But they say, but we don't want to pay the normal price that everyone else pays. We are not going to pay $1.50. We'll pay just $1. And we want to hold our tournament, we'll buy 1,000 cups. And Lenny says, wait a minute, my full cost per cup of lemonade is $1.75. I was pricing it at $1.50, I'm already losing money. Why would I accept a deal at $1? But we need to look at the margin. We're going to look at the contribution margins and see whether this is a good idea or not. So now, what's our number of cups sold? Well, we're going to operate both stands still, and there's an assumption here that no further direct or variable costs or direct costs are involved, direct fixed costs are involved in doing this extra business of 1,000 cups. We're just going to make Lenny and Jen and Dan work harder, but we're not going to pay them more, and we're not going to hire extra staff or get another stand. So we're able to do the same volume we did before, 4,000, plus the extra 1,000 cups. So we've got 4,000 cups at $1.50 plus 1,000 cups at $1. So our total revenue now is going to be 7,000 because we had the 6,000 in revenue plus the extra 1,000 cups at $1, so 7,000. We have 5,000 cups of lemonade, so our variable direct expense is 50 cents a cup times 5,000 cups, which is 2,500. And when we subtract our variable direct expense from our revenue, we get our variable contribution margin, which is 4,500. That's a positive number. We're happy. We have our same fixed direct expense, no change. That's our assumption that we can do this within our existing structure. So when we subtract our variable direct expense from our variable contribution margin, we get 1,500. That's a positive number. Again, we're happy. We're contributing to our indirect expense. We have Lenny's salary, which is 2,000, and when we subtract Lenny's salary from our variable contribution margin, we still have a loss, but our loss is less. We have reduced our loss by 50%. And this is by taking a deal that is less than our full cost and less than our normal price. And yet it was good. Why was it a good idea? Because the individual cost that the individual price of $1 minus the variable direct cost per unit, variable direct cost per unit of 50 cents, was still 50 cents. So we had a per unit variable contribution margin of 50 cents. We had a positive variable contribution margin, so it's a good thing to do that deal. Now, if everyone was paying that price, we wouldn't be able to make a profit. But as long as we have some people that are paying a higher price, at the margin, if we have that excess capacity and we're covering our variable direct expense, it's important to keep producing, and that's why we try and be very efficient and produce at the highest capacity we can within our direct cost structure. So that was a good thing to do, but we're still concerned about these indirect costs so high. People say, let's fire Lenny. Well, you can't fire the CEO, but maybe we could make Lenny do a little more work, some direct work. What if we fire Dan and we make Lenny take over Dan's stand? And so then Lenny has a half-time job as a stand attendant and just a half-time job as the CEO. That will reduce our indirect expense, and maybe that will help. So let's look at that scenario, our last scenario, and see what we've got. Well, if we have Lenny working Dan's stand, then we're going to do, let's assume, we'll do at least as well as Dan did. So our total number of cups sold will be the same as it was before, 4,000. At $1.50, our revenue, 6,000. If we sold 4,000 cups, our variable cost per unit from before stays the same, so 50 cents a cup times 4,000 cups is 2,000 in variable direct expense. So our variable contribution margin is 4,000. Positive number, we're happy. Our fixed direct expense, let's assume that we have the two stands, that's $1,000. We're paying $1,000 to Jen, and we will allocate 1,000 of Lenny's salary to this fixed direct expense because Lenny is working on producing cups of lemonade. So we have the same 3,000 in fixed direct expense. When we subtract 3,000 from 4,000, we have 1,000 contribution margin, direct contribution margin. What's left from the revenue after we subtract all the variable and the fixed direct expenses. And this is available to cover our indirect expense, which now, instead of being 2,000, is only 1,000. because 1,000 of Lenny's salary went as a fixed direct, and only 1,000 is an indirect expense. So we put down that 1,000 in indirect expense. When we subtract the 1,000 from the direct contribution margin, we've never been so happy in our lives to see a zero profit. At least it's not a loss. We have eliminated the loss from Lenny's Lemonade. I think the most important thing to get, and you'll get the vocabulary over time, using these terms they'll become more familiar. I think two important things to remember. What you figured out from the past, the 50 cents per cup, that can stay the same. We use that same 50 cents to estimate a number of scenarios for the future. So even though we calculated the variable direct cost per unit from a different volume in the past, that per unit cost can be used in different estimates, different volumes for estimating total cost in the future. So you can use a historical cost per unit to make projections for the future. That's the first thing I want you to take away. The second important thing is to realize that the bottom line, profit and loss, is not the only measure of profitability. That you sometimes need to look at the contribution margins, the variable contribution margin and the direct contribution margin, because as long as a service is contributing to the indirect costs, to the direct fixed and the indirect costs of an organization, then you probably don't want to stop that service. You want to try and increase the volume of that service so that you can have more revenue, and that revenue can cover those fixed expenses, whether they're direct or indirect. That's all. Thanks.